It's a marvellously timeless song.
When you fall into a trance, sitting on a sofa playing games of chance, with your folded arms and history books you glance into the eyes of Madame George.
If you look at some of his songs, like Madame George, for instance, other people have analysed, parsed, gone through it, done everything sort of an electronic microscope to find out about it, but you just lie back and listen to it. And when you think of it, you project as much onto that song as it ever gives you in literary meaning or literary understanding. It's like the best poetry. It really is.
And I had to ask that question, you know, kind of, what inspired it? Was it something kind of magical? And he said, you know, I haven't got a fucking clue. You know, you'd have a better idea than me. This is, I think, where it's the first example quite clearly of Van almost acting as a channel for the music.
And you know you gotta go on a train from Dublin up the sandy road, throwing pennies at the bridges down below, and the rain, hail, sleet and snow.
The Astral Weeks is a complete history of Van Morrison to that point. The disappearing world that is in Astral Weeks is reflected in the reference to Sandy Row in the song, because you don't get a train to Sandy Row anymore. That rail line, that train don't run no more. So, you know, immediately he's picking up on the fading city, a changing city.
The recording of it occurred at the same time that the Civil Rights March from Belfast to Derry had happened. You know, it was the time of Bernadette Devlin. It was the time when Northern Ireland and what was happening over there was worldwide news. It manages to capture a time that's already seemingly lost, and it is lost. I mean, the streetscapes of Belfast were transformed within a couple of years. That Belfast that Morrison talks about had gone. The innocence had long gone out of Belfast by the early 70s, and so that album instantly became also an artifact of a lost time.
In the early 70s, he said he likened Astral Weeks to being a sort of opera, in that it had this very visual quality and it was conceived as a total entity. And it's almost as if to take away or to indeed add an additional note, to subtract or add, would actually somehow mar the perfect entity that he's created with that record.
Astral Weeks was one of the early examples of a musician eschewing hit singles in favour of presenting the album as a form in itself. For all its artistic merit, the record was initially overlooked by the buying public, and Morrison sought to address the downturn in his commercial fortunes by finding a more accessible sound. His third solo collection, Moondance, represented a marked departure from the stripped-down folk elements of Astral Weeks and moved into the sonic territory occupied by big band and jazz.
You know, the Astral Weeks thing sold a bit, but I mean, I didn't get all the money, one of those stories, you know. I didn't really want to be in the rock and roll scene, so I decided, well, I have to do an album, you know, that's just really singing and songs and is about something and isn't rock and roll, because, you know, I want to get out of the rock and roll scene. So what happened was I did that album, and I did get out of the rock and roll scene to a certain extent. Then the critics started saying it was a rock album, right? And I mean, it's obvious to anybody with 2 ears, there's no rock and roll on that album at all. Right, so this was sort of a bit strange in the first place, because I get these reviews and it'd say, great rock album. Well, I thought, I mean, they're good reviews and all that, but the whole point of it was not to make a rock album, and now they're saying it's a rock album, so it was like, trying to put that together is a bit puzzling. So I say in interviews, it's not a rock album, but nobody listened anyway. Further on down the line, I realized that it was a success, the album, musically and creatively, right? But at the same time, I was starving. So I was in a situation where I was up against the wall because I didn't have any money. And, you know, I'm practically not eating at the time, because this, you know, critical acclaim is one thing, but I mean, money's something else. So I actually, the next album, I realized, well, I have to sort of do sort of something that's sort of like rock, because otherwise I'm going to starve.
He'd made a masterpiece that was almost completely ignored. He'd made no money out of it. He was broke. He decided there and then, almost as an exercise, I think, what I need is to write an album full of songs that are going to be played on the radio.
There is very little like that happening in the rock world at the time. I don't know about the jazz world. I was 16, 17 years old when Moondance came out, and it certainly didn't sound like anything else that I was aware of and listening to. Jazz people might tell you, oh yes, well it was, ripping off this, that, or the other. I just recognized it as a piece of jazz music, but a piece of jazz music, unlike most other jazz, that could actually connect with me as a sort of 16-year-old rock and roll fan. And somehow that song made that bridge.
Moondance, also it's got a great lyric. It's got a great little hook and a great chorus. It's almost a perfect song. I'd love to have the royalties.
Singer-songwriters were in vogue at the time, but Morrison had a certain edge on most singer-songwriters because he was a soul R&B vocalist. And, if you think of the Neil Youngs and the James Taylors, these were laid-back singer-songwriters. There was a certain meekness about the early singer-songwriters, many of whom had come through the folk tradition. Morrison had come through a show band tradition, he'd come through an R&B tradition, and he was potentially, his work was based around his vocal. It wasn't necessarily based around songs on paper, which was very much the case with the emerging singer-songwriters of the early 70s. They were sensitive, and Morrison was considered to be sensitive by certain American rock critics, but at the same time there was a gruffness, both in his voice and probably in his manner as well. He was a soul man at heart, and these other guys weren't. I mean, if you look at the early, the most successful singer-songwriters at that time, there's almost a female quality to them, and Morrison didn't have that. Morrison was very, very soulful, very black, very black soul.
Moondance provided Morrison with a musical context in which to extend the soul and jazz influence on his vocals. He introduced scat into his singing, a voice instrumental technique pioneered by the jazz artists Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong.
When you turn those heaters on, oh, it's me. Yeah. Jeepers, jeepers, oh, where'd you get those jeepers? Oh, those jeepers, how the distance tie. Where'd you get those jeepers?
Even early in his career, he's drawing on a range of influences that very few other people in rock music are. And so the vocal style and the sort of improvisation and the scat singing, he's familiar with all of that because he's heard it on his dad's Louis Armstrong records and whatever.
He's trying to capture an emotion, he's trying to capture a feel. He may not be the most articulate person in the world, so he's approximating it as he would with a musical instrument as to what he's doing. And when he's making music, if he runs out of words, he's going to have to, supplement it with something else. And scat singing was one way of doing that for jazz musicians and so forth. So I presume that's what he's doing.
Crafting an album firmly planted in R&B and jazz tradition also provided Morrison with a timely opportunity